Hey guys, people are straying. So a few days ago I was on Twitter and I saw a post by Jonah Barnes. He is a Mormon apologist and podcaster. He's on the Ward radio show. So I saw a post from him and it made my jaw drop and it genuinely made me angry. So, Jonah Barnes, this bonehead, this is what he said. Mass shooting at LDS Church in Michigan motivated by anti Mormonism, confirms FBI. Heck of a job to John DeLynn, Mark Driscoll, Alyssa Grenfield, and Haley Rawl. So this is just absurd. This is crazy. This is slanderous. This is ridiculous. This is total garbage. This guy, I'm sure he thinks he's like this really righteous guy, but if you're going to say something like this, then you are a scumbag. You are genuinely a scumbag. No morally sound, mentally healthy person would say something this disgusting. So the actual people that are mentioned here. So John DeLynn, he hosts the Mormon Stories podcast. He seems like the nicest guy, and also like the way his podcast works. He's not on his podcast screaming "kill Mormons" all day or whatever. He has a super wide variety of people on: historians, archaeologists, biographers, people who just talk about their experiences in the LDS Church, positive and negative in general. So this guy is not, some kind of ranting anti-Mormon lunatic. He's a very nice guy, super well balanced, and he's a really valuable resource for Mormons too, because not all Mormons fit the same mold. Not all Mormons, have that cookie cutter lifestyle. And it can be really nice to listen to someone who had your same experience. And, he hosts people like that on his podcast. So to accuse him of being culpable in this horrific mass shooting against Mormons is disgusting. Jonah Barnes is a slimy greaseball for saying this. So Alyssa Grenfield, she's a YouTuber. She's an atheist and a feminist. I don't say that to characterize her in a certain way. That's just who she is. So her criticisms of the LDS Church are more pointed. She's more apt to say that she believes the LDS Church is a cult. And, saying that does not mean that you're telling anyone to go murder Mormons. She talks about her own experience in the church, especially the negative aspects of growing up as a woman in the LDS Church, especially with a lot of the messaging that came from the church at the time she was growing up and church culture. So, maybe you think her stance is a little bit too harsh. Personally, I think it's more like a church with cult-like elements. I wouldn't say it's straight up a cult, though there's a decent amount of Mormons who are complete cultists, and that they will never criticize their own church. Everything the church, their leaders do must be perfect and inspired. They just, nothing's ever the church's fault, nothing's ever the fault of the church leaders. The church is perfect, and we're just imperfect mortals who don't always understand why it's perfect, or we're just falling for anti-Mormon propaganda. So I do think the church has cult-like elements, especially if you're talking about like the endowment. Like, that's pretty creepy, and there are certain members in the church who behave like complete cultists, frankly. But so, her line, the things she says are in a different angle from mine, because I'm not a feminist or an atheist or a woman. And she has a bit more edge than I do, but she certainly has never told anyone to go murder Mormons, has never said that the LDS Church needs to be destroyed. So no, she's not culpable for this horrific event either. Haley Rawl, I'm not really aware of her. I glanced at her stuff. It seemed like she was pretty similar to Alyssa Grenfield, but I'm not really super aware of her. Again, to my knowledge, she has not called for the beheading of Mormons. She has not declared a jihad. So this is just a stupid accusation from this really stupid man. So Mark Driscoll, he's the only one here who seems to be, if not an ex-Mormon or a non-Mormon. I don't really know much about him. And I looked at both of the Twitter accounts for him. I couldn't really find anything about Mormons. I'm sure he has stuff. And I will concede that if he's like a lot of these evangelicals that are on Twitter or even outside of Twitter in the real world and talk about Mormons, then he might be one of those people who has a small degree of culpability in this. I mean, This is the lone action of a crazy gunman. He wasn't part of a conspiracy of Mormon murderers. And frankly, to my knowledge, this is the first high-profile event like this. That's not to say that no one could possibly have any responsibility if they, genuinely incense violence against the LDS Church, but, this isn't like this established pattern where there's legions of people calling for Mormon deaths and there's tons of crazy people following them. This is a new paradigm. I think there's a lot of evangelicals, especially online, but also in their congregations preaching and in general, who legitimately, go too far. They say Mormons worship a devil or a demon. They say Mormon prophets, or they say Joseph Smith, was given the Book of Mormon by a demon. They say it's a devilish religion and whatever. And again, none of that is calling for murder of Mormons. They're not to blame for this crazy guy snapping and doing this crazy thing. But I do think that, that language is not helpful. And I wouldn't say they're at fault for the people who say, mainly it's evangelicals, who say kind of, very wild things about the LDS Church. I think there's a small degree of culpability. But, if you're part of any group of any kind, religious, political, racial, economic, whatever, there's someone out there saying negative things about you. There's always someone you could point at if you were targeted in some kind of horrific event like this. So I don't think it's enough to say, these guys criticized my church, or, they were really mean, they said we worship a devil. That's not enough to say that they're responsible for a mass shooting. And I don't even know if Mark Driscoll actually said that. Maybe. But John Dehlin, Lissa Granfield, Haley Rowell, they definitely did not say that. So yeah, Jonah Barnes, he is an egghead. But he is an egghead who was dropped on his head, so he's just kind of cracked in the head. This guy is a serious moron. And like I said, he's a slime ball. This is the type of thing you have to be a slimy, morally bankrupt person to say. This horrific tragedy targets people of his religious cohort, so he directs blame to high-profile critics of the LDS Church, even if they're like John Dehlin, legitimately very nice people. People who have never called for murder against Mormons or anything like that, but yeah, so, this is kind of a growing mindset in the LDS Church, which is the idea that the world is against us and, we don't have critics, we have enemies, It's not that they're a podcaster who explores negative aspects of our religion. They're our enemy. They're trying to get us all killed. It's kind of this, frankly, it's a cult-like apocalyptic mentality that religions, high-profile or high-demand religions like this often go to. They get public criticism, they get pushback, they have something horrific like this happen, and they insulate, they look upon critics and outsiders with suspicion, and, they transform even the most genuine, honest, kind critics into, people who have Mormon blood on their hands, stochastic terrorists. So yeah, Ward Radio, this guy should not be on Word Radio. This guy should not, I don't know. I think this guy should be, if you see this guy in a grocery store, I think you should say something like, hey, why'd you say that? Why did you accuse critics of your church of being responsible for that mass shooting event? At the very least, this guy should apologize. Until he apologizes, I'm going to keep rubbing, this thing he said in his face, because this was just absurd. This guy should apologize. Maybe the Ward Radio thing, that show should apologize. It sounds like based off this tweet, it sounds like they went into that in his show and, of course, blamed critics of the church, but I haven't seen that episode, so I can't say that did happen. But yeah, that's what I think. Maybe follow this guy on Twitter. Maybe rub it in his face a little. Maybe say, hey, why don't you apologize for this? Hey, what the heck is wrong with you? Why are you trying to blood libel your critics like this? Are you demented? Give them some heat, because this was a extremely retarded thing to say. Jonah Barnes is a bonehead and a slimeball, and he deserves to be treated as such. So yeah, thank you for watching, and yeah, maybe join in on the dog pile a little bit. Give this guy some heat. You know, Mormons, they're very nice people, and you know, Mormons don't really tend to see unkindness in other Mormons. There's generally the idea, you know, we're Mormons, we're awesome, we're super kind, we're very Christ-like, and there's a tendency to justify or look past when, you know, other Mormons, especially high-profile Mormons, say legitimately awful things like this. You know, I don't think he should get a blank check just because he's a popular podcaster, just because he's technically a passing apologist, though of course his apologetics are only convincing to Mormons, but that's how Mormon apologetics go. That's a topic for another video. So yeah, maybe give this guy some heat on Twitter. He definitely deserves it for being such a massive moron. But yeah, thank you for watching. Normally I'm a fairly nice guy, but when it comes to doofuses like this, well, anyway, have a good one. Bye.